Subscribe to Sinister Shadows Studio, The Shadow Next Door. I never paid much attention to the pale, thin man who moved into the apartment beside mine. He kept to himself, silently coming and going at all hours. The building was old, walls were thin, and often the sounds of daily life could be heard between units. With him, there was nothing. Silence. It was eerie, but I brushed it off as a quirk of the man. One evening, I dropped a jar of sauce while cooking. The shattering noise echoed throughout my unit, and I expected a complaint, or at least a knock on the wall from my mysterious neighbor. But nothing came. Later that night, as I drifted off to sleep, I heard the faintest of whispers through the wall. It sounded like a prayer, in a language I couldn't identify. Curiosity piqued. I pressed my ear to the wall. Suddenly, a piercing scream cut through the quiet. I jumped back, heart racing. The scream wasn't from the man, but rather a woman. The chilling cry seemed to come from inside his apartment. Immediately, I dialed 911. As I waited for the police, I could hear erratic pacing and muttering from the other side of the wall. He was speaking quickly, the tone frantic. The police arrived in record time, banging loudly on his door. The silence that followed was deafening. Eventually, they forced entry. I waited anxiously, peeking through the peephole. Officers searched his apartment, their flashlights cutting through the dark. Then they came out, their faces pale. An officer approached my door. "Ma'am, it's good you called," he said, clearing his throat. "There's no one in there now, but we found some troubling items." Curiosity took the better of me, and I asked to see for myself. Hesitantly, he let me in. The room was cold, much colder than it should have been. Strange symbols covered the walls, and in the center of the room lay a large pentagram, surrounded by candles and photos. The photos were of me. From years ago to just days before, all of them taken without my knowledge. Horrified, I turned to the officer. "Where is he? What was he planning to do?" The officer looked as shaken as I felt. "We don't know, but we'll find him." The man was never found, but for weeks after, strange events continued in his empty apartment. Sounds of whispers in the night, shadows passing by the windows, and once, a scream that echoed throughout the building. I moved out shortly after, but the memories of that apartment and the shadow next door still haunt me. Some nights, when all is quiet, I still hear the soft chanting, the whispers from the other side of the wall, and I wonder what true horrors my neighbor was involved in, the room below. I moved into a cozy basement apartment in an older part of town. It was a quiet neighborhood with trees arching over the roads and children playing on the sidewalks. The houses were vintage, giving off a historical charm. My landlord, Mrs. Hamilton, was a sweet elderly woman who lived in the main part of the house upstairs. She gave me a great deal on the rent, asking only for timely payment and a little company from time to time. About a week after I moved in, I began hearing noises from the adjacent basement room. It wasn't unusual to hear the water pipes or the creaks of an old house, but these noises were different. There were faint whispers and a shuffling sound, like someone was moving furniture around. I found it odd, since Mrs. Hamilton had mentioned that the room was just used for storage. One night, around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a soft crying sound. The cries weren't that of a child, but more like an adult, full of despair and grief. Alarmed, I walked over and pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Suddenly, the crying stopped and was replaced by an eerily calm, singing voice. The voice sang an old lullaby, the words of which I couldn't quite grasp. In the morning, I approached Mrs. Hamilton about it. She dismissed it casually, explaining that the old pipes sometimes made strange noises. But her eyes, those eyes told a different story. They darted away, refusing to meet mine. One evening, as I was washing my dishes, I dropped a glass. As I bent down to pick up the shards, I noticed a small gap at the base of the wall connecting the two basements. Curiosity piqued. I decided to peek through, expecting to see old furniture or stored goods. What I saw instead was a sight I'll never forget. There was a dimly lit room with walls that looked like they hadn't been painted in decades. The center of the room had a rusty chain anchored to the ground, and attached to it was a figure. The figure was emaciated, with long tangled hair, barely clothed, and was swaying back and forth. Suddenly, she looked up directly at the gap, making eye contact with me. Her eyes, cloudy with cataracts, were full of pain and anguish. I recoiled in horror, my heart racing. The next morning, I confronted Mrs. Hamilton. With hesitation and tears in her eyes, she began to tell me a story that had been a secret for decades. Back in the 1950s, her younger sister, Eleanor, had developed severe mental issues. Given the times and the lack of proper mental health care, the family had decided to lock her in the basement, thinking they were protecting her and themselves. Over time, they provided her with minimal care, and she was soon forgotten as a dark family secret. "I thought she had passed away years ago," Mrs. Hamilton sobbed. "I never checked the room after my parents died." The police were called, and Eleanor was taken to a hospital. They found journals in that dimly lit room, decades worth of writings. They spoke of loneliness, longing for sunlight, and hearing the world outside but never being a part of it. The haunting part? The last entry simply read, "I know someone is listening now." I moved out immediately after. The house was later sold, and the new owners renovated the entire property, hopefully erasing the dark memories. But the image of Eleanor, the sounds of her cries, and the depth of her isolation are imprints that will remain with me forever. The Silent Watcher. Living in a big city, it's not uncommon to become accustomed to the sounds of bustling streets, honking horns, and the occasional loud neighbor. But when I moved into my new apartment on 5th Street, the quiet of the neighborhood was almost unsettling. The building was old, with tall ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and large, drafty windows. The only other tenant was an elderly man named Mr. Davis, who lived directly above me. The first few nights were peaceful, but one evening, as I lay in bed reading, I heard a tapping sound coming from above. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but the rhythmic tapping continued. Tap, 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 each interval exactly 3 seconds apart. The next day, as I was taking out the trash, I ran into Mr. Davis. He was tall, with gray hair and a stooped posture. His eyes were an unusual shade of pale blue, almost translucent. I mentioned the tapping, and he simply stared at me, silent for a moment before muttering, "I'll try to be quieter." That night, the tapping began again. This time, it moved from the ceiling above my bed to above the kitchen, then the bathroom, as if tracking my movements throughout the apartment. Feeling unnerved, I decided to go upstairs and speak to Mr. Davis directly. Knocking on his door, the old polished wood felt cold to the touch. The door slowly creaked open to reveal the dimly lit interior. Mr. Davis stood there, his pale eyes staring intently at me. I explained the situation, and he simply nodded, apologizing again. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of his living room. There were photographs covering the walls. Squinting, I realized with a jolt of horror that they were all pictures of me. Some were taken from afar, while others seemed to be zoomed in, showing me in my apartment through the windows. Panicking, I hurried downstairs and bolted my door. The tapping began again, more insistent this time. Tap, tap, tap. I called the police, and while I waited, I pushed furniture against the door for added security. When the officers arrived, they searched Mr. Davis's apartment. He was gone, but what they found confirmed my worst fears. Along with the photographs, there were detailed notes about my daily routines, conversations I had on the phone, even descriptions of my outfits. The investigation revealed a hidden crawlspace that connected our two units, allowing Mr. Davis to watch and hear me from above. But the most chilling discovery was a room with a chair positioned directly above my bed, surrounded by drilled holes in the floor. Despite the police's best efforts, Mr. Davis was never found. I moved out immediately, and for a long time, I struggled to find peace in any home. Every tap or creak would send my heart racing, and I always felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me. While the memory has faded somewhat over the years, one question still haunts me. How long was Mr. Davis watching me before I ever noticed? Subscribe to Sinister Shadows Studio.